I want to show you what these verses in Ephesians chapter 4 are all about. Let's remember where we've been so far in Ephesians 4. In the first 6 verses, the Apostle Paul was urging the Christians in Ephesus to maintain the unity that the Holy Spirit had already created. And then in verses 7 all the way down to verse 16, Paul continues this idea of how to maintain the unity of the Spirit. Here's what he says. God gives to the church gifts for Christians to use in order to help build up the church. And when the church grows, it grows together and therefore unites. So we're going to look at this passage, part 1 here in verses 7 through 10. Let's get started. The first thing that we noticed in verse 7 is just this basic point. What does Jesus do to help Christians maintain the unity of the Spirit? Well, what we see here in verse 7 is that Jesus gives gifts to the church. Look at verse 7. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. See, here we're talking about Christ, something Christ does. He gives gifts to the church. Notice the way Paul talks about it. Grace was given. When Jesus dies on the cross for someone, that's him giving you grace. But Jesus gives grace in other ways. He gives grace by giving things to Christians, specifically gifts, spiritual gifts. Now, when someone is athletic or musical, we might say that person's very gifted, and that's right. And any ability anyone has really is a gift from God. But this passage and other passages like Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, I think are talking about spiritual gifts specifically. You can read in those other passages lists about the gift of serving or the gift of teaching, the gift of encouraging or the gift of mercy. God shows grace by giving us spiritual gifts. Jesus gives gifts to the church. And notice that Jesus doesn't give everyone the same gift. He gives according to the measure of Christ's gift. Jesus measures out different gifts to different people. As a dad, sometimes I'm the one measuring out the amount of cereal and milk that each of my children receive. Not all the children always receive the same kind of cereal or the same amount of cereal. Sometimes it gets measured out a little bit differently. God gives Christians gifts. And how many Christians? Each one of us receives a gift. But it's according to the measure of Christ's gift. Here's a passage that talks about it in Romans chapter 12. It talks about the gifts God gives to us. Listen to this in Romans 12, verse 3. For by the grace given to me, notice how similar that is, grace given to me. I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Hear that language of measuring it out again. And then he says this in verse 6, having gifts that differ. See, so God gives different people different gifts. According to the grace given to us, there's that phrase again, let us use them. Okay, so what Paul is saying here in verse 7 of Ephesians chapter 4 is that Jesus gives gifts to Christians. Each Christian a gift, and to different Christians go different gifts and different amounts. Now, what Paul does in the next couple of verses 8, 9, and 10, is he makes an argument to say Jesus has the right and the ability to give gifts to Christians. And I want you to notice how Paul does this. Paul makes this argument. Jesus has the absolute right to give gifts to Christians because he quotes this verse from Psalm 68. Psalm 68. And what he does basically is he says Psalm 68 is a picture of what Jesus does when he gives gifts. Psalm 68 is a picture of why Jesus has the right to give gifts to Christians and the ability to give gifts to Christians. So if we're going to understand this, we're going to need to know something about Psalm 68. Psalm 68 is a beautiful psalm. It's a victorious psalm. It's a very poetic description of how God led Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. And basically it's recounting all the ways that God defeated all of Israel's enemies and how he kind of leads this procession up to Jerusalem. He ascends, key word, ascends up to Jerusalem, and behind him it's kind of like there's this train of all the captives, all the enemies that God has defeated. And then it describes all the tribute that pours in now. And it's just a psalm celebrating that. Listen especially to Psalm 68, verse 18. This is the verse that Paul quotes in Ephesians 4. You, speaking to God, you ascended on high, like you marched up to Jerusalem, leading a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men. So that's what Paul goes back to, and he says this is a picture of what Jesus did, what Jesus accomplished when he had victory over all of his enemies. So let's go back to Ephesians 4. Paul quotes Psalm 68, and he says that's a picture of the victory Jesus had over his enemies. When he ascended on high, he led a host of captives. And it's like, since Jesus has victory over all his enemies, he sits on top of the tribute pile. And so he can give gifts to other Christians. So Psalm 68, it's saying God had victory over his enemies. And Paul says that's a picture of how Jesus has victory over his enemies. So some people ask this about Ephesians 4, who are the captives? Some people have taught that to mean that the captives in Ephesians 4 are talking about people that Jesus rescued. And so it's like they were held captive by Satan and Jesus rescued them. But I don't think that's what Paul's saying, because Psalm 68, it doesn't describe people that God rescued. It describes people, enemies that God defeated. And so if that's a picture of Jesus, I think the captives here have to be describing God's enemies, Jesus' enemies. Well, who are Jesus' enemies that he defeated? Well, I think we get a mention of this in Ephesians chapter 1. Ephesians chapter 1 talks about how Jesus was raised from the dead and then raised up to the heavenly places, and he's far above all rule, authority, power, and dominion, and every name that's named. So that's talking about the rulers and authorities. That's talking about the evil spirits, the powers of evil that Jesus now rules over, and how all things are under his feet. Jesus, through his work on the cross, did something amazing. He defeated all of his enemies. Colossians 2 talks about how there's this record of debt that stood against us, but Jesus nailed it to the cross. And it says that in doing this, it says, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. So who are the captives in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 8? I think these are the evil forces that Jesus prevails over and puts to open shame. Okay, now, verses 9 and 10, it's Paul's way of kind of providing commentary. It's Paul's way of saying, here's how Psalm 68 is a picture of what Jesus did. Listen to what Paul says. In saying he ascended, note here the parallel, in saying he ascended, what does it mean? That he had also descended into the lower regions, the earth. He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. Okay, what's going on here? What does Paul mean when he says that all this ascending and descending business? Well, I think it's just saying Jesus, we have this beautiful picture in the New Testament of Jesus ascending up into heaven. And Paul is saying, well, if Jesus did that, first he had to come to earth. He had to descend. What does Paul mean, though, about how Jesus descended to the lower regions? Some Christians take that to mean that Jesus descended into hell. The Apostles' Creed itself says, he descended into hell. I think there's some real problems with that interpretation, though. I don't think that's what Paul's saying here. I think there's real problems with saying that Jesus descended into hell. First, this text doesn't say anything about hell. It just mentions the lower regions. It seems a bit of a stretch to insert into this verse a whole doctrine of Jesus descending into hell. Another reason I think there's a problem with this is that when the Bible does describe Jesus' ascension, what's the starting point? It's not hell. Instead, it's earth. Jesus ascends from earth up to heaven. Another reason is Jesus didn't defeat his enemies by descending into hell and doing something in hell. He defeated his enemies by descending to earth and dying on the cross. Another reason, Paul doesn't mention hell or Hades. He just mentions the lower regions, namely the earth. And there's different ways to translate that, and Christians debate this. But I think just if you're in heaven, this is very general language, lower regions. If you're in heaven, earth, that is the lower regions. One more reason I don't think this is talking about how Jesus descended into hell is, remember what Jesus said to the thief on the cross? He said, today you will be with me in paradise. So all that to say, I don't think this is talking about how Jesus descended into hell. I think it's saying this. Jesus became a man, and on earth he died on the cross. He defeated all of his enemies, all the spiritual forces of darkness. And then he went to heaven. And the reason Jesus has the ability to give gifts to Christians is that he reigns over all of his enemies. I think that's what this text is all about. Now, pause here and just think, isn't it good for us to remember the true nature of the authority structure in the universe? Psalm 2 says this, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And then it goes on to say, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. I think this is a good reminder, by the way, of the fact that Jesus truly does sit on his throne. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.